Innovation. If there's one thing that's been a hallmark of the Ukrainian military in its brave defense against Russia's overwhelming forces, it's the ability to innovate under pressure. But innovation doesn't always involve working away inside a lab to come up with new weapons. Sometimes a soldier can be innovative by combining the right amounts of bravery, tenacity, and a hint of craziness with their sheer will to win. That's what Ukraine's new tactic is all about. It's using 155mm shells like they're grenades. But why? What seems insane on the surface is just another example of Ukraine's ability to adapt under fire. News of Ukraine's new tactic comes from Defense Express. On August 6, it pointed out that a fierce battle is raging on Ukraine's eastern front. Russian President Vladimir Putin has dedicated a new force of 110,000 soldiers to join those already fighting in Ukraine's east, in yet another example of Russia attempting to use its numbers advantage to wear Ukraine down. And it's working. For every Russian soldier that Ukraine takes out of the war, and there have been over 1.06 million of them so far, says Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, a bullet has to be spent, a bomb has to explode, a drone has to conduct a kamikaze raid. Putin's goal is to force Ukraine into using all of its ammunition, eventually leaving its defenders unable to fight, not because their will is gone, but because they no longer have the weapons they need. The Russian strategy brings us back to what some Ukrainian soldiers have started doing. And what they've come up with is the answer to a question. How do you assault a Russian position when you've run out of grenades and rockets you could fire at that fortification? The answer is as insane as it is ingenious. You strap a time delay fuse onto a 155mm artillery shell and in a superhuman display of strength and endurance, carry it to the Russian position. Drop, run and duck immediately afterward because the massive explosion that results is enough to take out anybody unfortunate enough to be standing within range. When you don't have grenades or other explosives you can propel, physically carrying artillery shells on time delay fuses to your enemy's position is a brave and slightly crazy way to overcome in a situation where you should never been able to win. It all reads like a story out of a war film, right? The tactic is almost too insane to believe, but you don't have to take our word for it. There is a video of Ukrainian soldiers using this brilliant solution to the Russian problem that proves that soldiers are hefting artillery shells right to Russia's doorstep. That video has been shared on the Telegram social media platform by an online magazine named Vodogray. The circumstances are just slightly different. As Vodogray explains, the weapon seen in the footage is a 120mm mine rather than the slightly larger artillery shells Ukraine has started using. But the method is the same, and there's no denying the sheer level of bravery being showcased. The footage, which only lasts for about 30 seconds, starts by showing movement from a Ukrainian soldier's point of view. Likely filming his actions using a shoulder or head-mounted camera, the soldier is carrying a mine out of an almost destroyed building. There are little hints of the modifications the Ukrainian soldier has made to the mine. What appears to be a fuse occasionally pops into view, though most of what we see during the next few seconds is the soldier navigating his way through some overgrowth. At about the 10-second mark, we see a door. That door is the soldier's target, and it's almost right next to the doorway from which the soldier emerged. That adds a whole new level of bravery to the endeavour. Ukraine soldiers had clearly managed to get so close to the Russian position as to be practically on top of it. If they had grenades, they would have been able to simply throw them into the doorway and be done with their assault. No grenades were present. The hand-delivered explosive would have to do. The Ukrainian soldier is quick with his actions. Rather than hanging around the door, he throws the makeshift explosive inside. Then he turns and runs, fast. The soldier clears the building and dives into some nearby rubble, just in time to turn around and see the smoke rising from the doorway as his bomb goes off. A second or two of delay would have spelled the end for the Ukrainian soldier. But he knew what he needed to do. It's brave, it's reckless, but above all else, it's effective. And that's all that matters to a country facing what seems to be impossible odds. No matter what the weapon, and no matter how insane that weapon might seem, if it works, it's something that Ukraine can use to slow down Putin's invading forces. Still, there's no denying what we see in Vodogray's footage is more than a little dangerous. Some would even say potentially suicidal, and it's for these reasons that Ukraine's new strategy has a name that harkens back to the days of World War II, the Banzai Grenade. Ukraine's use of heavy munitions for urban combat in close quarter showcases equal parts bravery and desperation, Defense Express says, and it's reminiscent of a last gasp strategy that Japanese soldiers used over 80 years ago. The name Banzai Grenade references what were once called Banzai charges. Fandom explains what those charges were. When Japanese soldiers felt that they were penned in by opposing forces, they refused to give up. Surrender wasn't an option because of the shame it could bring, so infantry that were backed into a corner decided the only thing left for them to do was to launch a last-ditch attack. The Japanese infantry would charge at their opponents. The idea seemed to be that the sheer shock of the insane attack would be enough to create a possibility of victory. And it worked. Sometimes. Far more often, the Banzai charges failed, but even then, the danger wasn't over. Fandom says that the soldiers taking part in these charges were usually instructed to commit suicide via the grenades they carried, ideally close to enemy soldiers, so their deaths would take an opponent with them. As World War II fandom quotes one anonymous US Marine as saying, "Whenever we cornered the enemy and there was no way out, we faced the dreaded Banzai attack." The word dreaded offers another hint as to why Japan used to do this. The Banzai attack was meant to strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. Yes, the attack was repelled more often than not, but psychologically, Japan's enemies would know that the soldiers they cornered would always fight to the death rather than surrender. Those sacrifices were intended to sap morale to the point where attacks were weakened and Japan could eventually prevail. It didn't work. Japan ended up on the losing side of World War II. Ukraine's new tactic isn't quite so desperate, and it certainly isn't as suicidal as a Banzai attack so long as it's executed correctly. However, it's carried out in a similar spirit. Japan soldiers would use whatever they had to hand in their Banzai charges, from machine guns and rifles to bayonets and knives. Ukraine is doing something similar, though its makeshift Banzai grenades are at least weapons that have an explosive impact and can be somewhat controlled thanks to the use of time delay fuses. What we see here is Ukrainian innovation at its strangest. After all, the concept of Banzai grenades have never been done before. As one ex-user named CJ put it, "In 13 years of doing military stuff, I've never heard of or seen anyone using a mortar round to clear a room, until today." And it's this level of innovation that's resulted in Ukraine becoming such an effective fighting force against Russia. So effective, in fact, that the American Foreign Policy Council is on record as stating on May 5 that Ukraine is a military laboratory. Russia's gradual advances against Ukraine have forced constant innovation that's teaching the world how to fight a modern ground war. The use of unmanned systems is the most obvious of Ukraine's adaptations to Putin's approach. Those drones do everything from ambushing Russian troops and taking out mechanized units to delivering medical supplies to stricken soldiers on the field. Ukraine is also leaning into using virtual reality to train its soldiers, and it's home to a defense industry that's seen the few dozen companies it had before Putin invaded grow to over 1,500. The Banzai Grenade is far from the most high-tech of Ukraine's innovations, but it's now battle-tested. Could it end up being the inspiration for another version of the same weapon in the future? A version that's safer and perhaps delivered by the drones that Ukraine is building in record numbers? Perhaps, though we'll have to wait to see what Ukraine's soldiers cook up next. Therein lies the point. Every new idea that Ukraine comes up with goes from concept to execution while an active battle rages. Ukraine's ideas represent innovation in action, getting tangible results against Russian troops rather than being tested to exhaustion in a lab without actually seeing combat. Ultimately, it's the creative spirit that inspired a weapon as crazy as the Banzai Grenade that will lead to Ukraine being one of the figureheads in Europe's collective defense against Putin. That's according to Atlantic Council writer David Kirichenko. Ukraine's dramatically expanded armed forces and groundbreaking defense tech sector make the country an indispensable partner for Europe, Kirichenko explained. He points out that Europe is growing increasingly uncertain of the US and its reliance on that major military power. In this uncertain environment, it makes good sense for Europe to upgrade its support for the Ukrainian army while deepening collaboration with Ukrainian defense tech companies, Kirichenko adds. The London School of Economics and Political Science agrees with that point, claiming in April that Ukraine's innovative and growing defense industry may just be Europe's best asset for achieving independence from its reliance on the United States. Does that mean we're going to see Banzai grenades making their way into Europe's army soon? Of course not. A weapon that is equal parts clever and crazy won't be widely adopted by anybody, including Ukraine. But the idea, the creative seed that led to a soldier strapping a fuse to a mine or a mortar round, that's the sort of thinking that can lead to the development of new weapons, as it has in so many cases for Ukraine in the past. Now let's bring things back down to earth for a moment. While the sheer inventiveness on display with Ukraine's Banzai grenades is impressive to witness, there's a very real reason why Ukraine's soldiers are having to come up with such extreme weapons. Ukraine is dealing with a munitions shortage. We mentioned earlier that Putin's strategy is to grind Ukraine down through attritional warfare until his enemy finally breaks. Unfortunately for some Ukrainian units, that creates situations where they find themselves fighting Russian troops without the weapons they need. The Banzai grenade was born out of that problem. If you don't have grenades, use mines and artillery shells. Still, this is a problem that needs to be solved. There is a clear need for high-power munitions tailored for infantry assaults in urban environments. The current use of artillery rounds in improvised roles reflects the same level of improvisation seen in the use of the TM-62M anti-tank mines as payloads for FPV drones, Defense Express says in its report on Ukraine's new tactic. And it's not wrong. Ukraine has made great strides towards boosting its domestic defense sector. According to the BBC, Ukraine's domestic weapons industry produces 30% of the weapons that the country military uses as of February 2025. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants that number to be higher. In July, Army Technology reported that he wants Ukraine to be building 50% of its own weapons by the end of 2026. And that it's now at the point where 40% of the weapons its army uses come from Ukraine. This is all very impressive for a country that barely had a defense manufacturing industry prior to Putin's invasion. But even if Ukraine gets to the point that it's making 50% of the weapons its army uses, that still leaves another 50% that have to come from elsewhere. Other countries have to be involved. And that means munition gaps get created thanks to delays or those countries simply not being able to provide everything that Ukraine needs. Risky weapons like the Banzai grenade wouldn't need to be invented if these gaps were filled. Several people in Europe are all too aware of that fact. One of them is Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. On July 3rd, United 24 media reported her as saying, "If there are any gaps in weapon supplies, I believe we must fill them. Over a year ago, we established a model to support defense production directly inside Ukraine. It's working very well." She's referring to the Danish model that has aided Ukraine's domestic industry in its recent growth. But that isn't enough. The mere fact that Ukraine is using mines and artillery rounds proves that munition gaps exist. Those gaps need to be filled. As impressive as the Banzai grenade may be, it's not a weapon that any Ukrainian soldier wants to be using, at least not in its current improvised form. It's too dangerous. There's a massive risk that something could go wrong. One slip or stumble as a soldier tries to escape the blast, and it's all over. Having said all of that, the very existence of the Banzai grenade showcases something that Ukraine has proven many times already. Its soldiers demonstrate unreal strength and determination in their fight against Russian troops. Think back to the video of a Banzai grenade in use that we discussed earlier. That video started at the point where the Ukrainian soldier was ready to use his makeshift weapon. What we didn't see was the entire process of getting the mine he used to the location shown in the video. That mine would have been carried by hand during an assault against a Russian position. The soldier may have marched miles with it before he had a chance to deploy it. Defense Express explains what this really means on the battlefield, especially when artillery shells are involved. This adaptation speaks volumes about the extreme physical demands placed on Ukrainian defenders. A soldier must carry a 40-kilogram shell through urban combat zones and then throw it with enough force and accuracy to inflict damage on enemy troops. Ukraine soldiers meet those physical demands daily. They display a level of courage and sheer mettle that Putin never expected. Remember, Russia's leader expected Ukraine to roll over and submit to his will within days of him launching his supposed special military operation. Russia's 200,000 soldiers were supposed to sweep into Kyiv while facing little to no resistance. Almost 4 years later, we know that's not what happened. Ukraine is still fighting. The Banzai Grenade is a microcosm of the sheer will and spirit of Ukraine soldiers to continue the fight, even when dealing with an enemy who's willing to sacrifice over 1 million of his own soldiers to his cause. Still, it would be nice if Ukraine soldiers didn't have to physically carry such massive rounds to Russia's defensive positions. That may be a possibility in the future. Ukraine's use of Banzai grenades show that the concept works, even if it's more than a little on the crazy side right now. Adaptation in the form of using ground drones to carry these shells, rather than humans, could be the next step. Ukraine has shown it can use these kinds of drones to hurt Russia before. Back in April 2024, Business Insider reported on one strike in which Ukraine used a ground drone to roll an explosive right to the edge of a Russian trench. The explosive was dropped, the trench blew up, and Ukraine had a minor victory. Drones carrying Banzai bombs could achieve the same result. Plus, the drones could serve as sacrificial lambs by hoisting artillery shells to Russian positions before blowing themselves up. Ukraine would need to come up with longer fuses or a way to remotely detonate its bombs, but it may well have drones sooner rather than later. The Atlantic Council reports that Ukraine's expansion of its drone army includes a goal to build up to 15,000 ground robots by the end of 2025. With a little tweaking, the dangerous Banzai bomb could become a very effective weapon. And if any country could make those tweaks, it's Ukraine. Right now, it has a crazy concept. In the future, that concept could become a nightmare for Putin's forces. Now, at the very least, the Banzai bomb is more effective than what Russia has its soldiers doing with mines. Self-exploding Russians are carrying landmines on their backs, and they're not getting the chance to use them as makeshift bombs. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the latest and strangest Ukrainian innovations.